The North Atlantic was a living, breathing beast in the spring of 1943, gray, heaving, and merciless. At dawn on the first day of May, the horizon looked less like a line and more like a blade, sharp, cold, and shimmering with a metallic light that sliced the ocean into restless pieces. Wind tore across the surface in jagged strokes. Waves rose like dark shoulders, slamming themselves against steel hulls. And beneath that churning surface, silent, unseen, crept Germany's most feared predators, the U-boats. For 3 years their reign seemed unquestionable. They had stalked the sea like spirits of vengeance, claiming thousands of Allied ships in a shadow war where the only sounds were the hum of diesel engines, the splash of torpedoes slipping free, and the distant, hollow thunder of sinking tonnage. The men who commanded these submarines, the so-called U-boat aces, were celebrated with medals, myth, and propaganda posters that painted them as invincible knights of the deep. But on that cold May morning, something had shifted. The hunters no longer felt like hunters. Above them, convoys moved as though wrapped in an invisible armor, untouchable, impenetrable, almost supernatural. In April alone, U-boats had suffered losses unimaginable just a year earlier. Dozens had vanished beneath crushing pressure or bloomed into fire on the surface under aircraft attack. Admiral Karl Donitz, the architect of the submarine war, could feel the tide turning in ways that statistics made undeniable and morale made unbearable. And so emerged the contradiction that defined the crisis. The U-boats, once the terror of the Atlantic, were suddenly dying faster than they could strike, yet no one on board understood why. In the pens at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, the mood had curdled from confidence to confusion. Officers gathered around charts littered with red X's, marks that only months ago would have represented Allied losses but now were their own. Radio intercepts spoke of convoys crossing the ocean with shockingly few casualties. Patrol routes, once rich with opportunity, now produced nothing but danger. Radar, once a vague experimental threat, seemed to be everywhere, in the air, on ships, even on the very waves themselves. Donitz issued the order. The U-boat arm had 8 weeks to understand what had changed, 8 weeks to survive, adapt, or disappear from the war entirely. This ultimatum sent ripples through both sides of the conflict. In Britain, in the war rooms deep beneath Whitehall, analysts pored over reports from Bletchley Park, RAF Coastal Command, and escort captains returning from the edge of the world. They knew their weapons: Lee lights, centimetric radar, Hedgehog mortars, faster escort carriers, were turning the tide. But even they were astonished by how quickly and completely the noose had tightened. The Allied transformation was not the work of one invention, but a symphony of industrial power, intelligence breakthroughs, and relentless trial and error. Germany, meanwhile, was fighting a war of fading secrets. Their Enigma codes, once unbreakable, were now leaking information like cracks in a dam. Their torpedoes, so lethal early in the war, were met with escorts that moved in coordinated, deadly packs. Their wolfpack tactics, ambush, swarm, strike, vanish, suddenly failed against convoys that maneuvered with uncanny awareness, as if guided by a hand that the U-boat captains could not see. The U-boats were not merely losing the battle, they were losing the mystery that had once been their greatest weapon. And yet, inside each steel coffin moving through the deep, there remained a stubborn core of belief. These were men who had crossed the Atlantic dozens of times, who had memorized the taste of recycled air and the feel of pressure on their eardrums as they slipped below periscope depth. They were veterans of storms, depth charges, and the eternal night beneath the waves. Many of them had sunk ships so large they seemed like floating cities. The idea that convoys had suddenly become untouchable felt like a blow to the very identity they had forged through fire and salt water. That was the conflict at the heart of the story. An elite force built on precision, courage, and myth facing an enemy that no longer behaved according to the rules they thought governed the sea. On the Allied side, the war had become a moral crusade to keep Britain alive, a battle for supply, survival, and civilization itself. The escorts that guarded the convoys were manned by sailors who knew the stakes. Every ship that survived meant food, fuel, aircraft, and weapons arriving to keep the war effort alive. Every ship lost was more than steel sinking, it was a threat to the future of freedom in Europe. On the German side, the U-boat arm was the tip of a spear that the Third Reich believed would starve the British Empire into collapse. Their struggle was not just naval, it was ideological, born from a belief in technological supremacy and the heroism of individuals who could turn the tide with discipline and daring. May 1943 sat at the crossroads of these worlds. It was the month when the myth of U-boat invincibility collided headfirst with the cold reality of Allied innovation. It was the moment when courage met mathematics, when instinct met intelligence networks, when the lone submarine ace faced an entire ecosystem of radar, aircraft, and encrypted coordination. It was the beginning of the end for the hunters of the deep. And yet, the true story of those 8 weeks is not merely a tale of machines or strategies. It is a story about human nature, the refusal to accept defeat, the shock of encountering an enemy transformed, and the desperate search for understanding in a war that changed faster than the men fighting it could comprehend. This documentary explores the precise, pressure-filled days of those 8 weeks. Days when every patrol, every signal, every sinking or survival told a piece of a larger truth. A truth about how technology reshapes destiny. About how belief can blind even the finest warriors. About how, in the furnace of conflict, civilizations discover what makes them vulnerable, and what makes them endure. As the month of May 1943 dawned over the Atlantic, the question was simple but terrifying. Had the U-boat arm reached the limits of its power? And the answer would define the future of the war. Act I, Build Up, the last breath of the Wolfpack era. In the early months of 1943, the U-boat arm stood at a crossroads without realizing it. The commanders of the Atlantic campaign still carried the swagger of earlier triumphs. Posters across German cities showed U-boat captains standing tall against the sea, their caps angled, their decorations gleaming under stage lights. Newspapers boasted of shipping losses so crippling that Britain seemed only months from starvation. Inside the cold, damp pens at Lorient and Street Nazir, crews cleaned their boats with the meticulous devotion of craftsmen, believing every patrol was a chance to carve new legends into history. But the numbers told a more fragile truth. The Allies had transported nearly 40 million tons of goods across the Atlantic in 1942 alone: food, fuel, bombers, tanks, dehydrated milk, aircraft parts, timber, boots, tools, each crate a building block of survival. Germany, meanwhile, had launched an enormous gamble. Over 100 submarines at sea, the largest of the war. This was Donit's dream of a black tide, a massed Wolfpack strategy meant to squeeze the life out of the British Isles. By March 1943, it seemed to be working. Convoy HX-229 and SC-122 suffered a combined 21 ships sunk in a single running battle across the Atlantic. U-boat crews toasted with contraband schnapps in their bunks. Donitz believed the victory confirmed his doctrine. If enough submarines attacked one convoy, even the strongest escorts could not hold them off. But the celebration masked an approaching storm. For while Germany was doubling down on mass attack tactics, the Allies were transforming the battlefield itself. The rising wall of Allied power. Unknown to most German captains, the Allies had fused 3 breakthroughs into a single deadly network. Centimetric radar, 10 centimeters wavelength, could spot U-boat periscopes at distances once thought impossible. Unlike earlier radar, it could not be detected by German Metox receivers. The submarines were being hunted by a weapon they didn't know existed: escort carriers, Woolworth carriers. Mass-produced in American shipyards, these small carriers brought aircraft into the mid-Atlantic air gap, eliminating the last safe zone for U-boats. Crews of the Royal Navy and U.S. Navy now patrolled waters previously unreachable. HF/DF, high-frequency direction finding, HFDUF, allowed convoys to pinpoint U-boat radio transmissions and detour around Wolfpacks before the Germans even realized contact had been broken. The U-boats were walking into ambushes they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't understand. Germany's greatest tactical asset, tight radio-controlled Wolfpack coordination, had turned into a glowing beacon pointing straight to their position. Still the U-boat men steamed out. Still they believed. For belief had carried them through storms, depth-charge barrages, and years of endless war. They did not know the sea had changed beneath them. Act 2, Turning Point, the 8-week crisis begins. The first signs. The first week of May 1943 produced statistics so grim that Donitz struggled to process them. 16 U-boats destroyed in 5 days, convoys completed with 0 losses, multiple Wolfpacks scattered by overwhelming air presence, radar contacts reported even in heavy fog. An officer described the mood in BDU U-boat command, headquarters. It felt as if the ocean itself had turned enemy. Donitz ordered new patrol patterns, new ambush routes, tighter coordination. He sent out directives reminding crews that the fate of Germany depended on them. But the losses mounted faster than the orders could be typed. The shadow weapons, the truth revealed. As more U-boats failed to return, fragments of survivor testimony revealed the horrifying truth. The Allies could see them without being seen. Centimetric radar, unbeknownst to almost everyone in the German Navy, was sweeping the ocean like a silent scythe. Aircraft were descending upon U-boats at night, in storms, in conditions once considered perfect for stealth. Lee lights pierced the darkness seconds before bombs fell. Destroyers veered toward dive angles with uncanny accuracy, as if guided by instinct or fate. But it was neither. It was mathematics, magnetrons, and the industrial might of nations fighting for survival. Every breakthrough on the Allied side pushed the U-boats deeper underground, literally. Captains resorted to traveling submerged during the day, despite the strain on batteries and oxygen. But submerged travel reduced speed and crippled their ability to intercept convoys, turning once deadly predators into slow-moving, blind refugees of war. Admiral King's arsenal. Across the ocean, American shipyards were rewriting the map of naval power. The United States poured out escort carriers, destroyer escorts, and long-range patrol aircraft with assembly line efficiency. Factories produced Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, one every 3 days. It was an industrial duel the Third Reich could not mathematically win. The U-boats' 8-week deadline, meant to uncover hidden Allied advantages, became a countdown to their own unraveling. Act 3, Confrontation, the War Titans. Convoy ONS-5 became the centerpiece of the struggle, a massive clash involving 40 merchant ships and over 30 U-boats. The U-boat attack. The wolf packs attacked in waves, believing numbers would overwhelm the escorts. They expected chaos. They expected fire. They expected the rich harvest of their early war glory. What they encountered instead was coordination of terrifying precision. The Allied response. Huff Duff intercepted their first radio signals before contact was even made. Radar-equipped escorts sliced through the darkness, turning to meet U-boats before torpedoes left their tubes. Air patrols arrived earlier than expected, circling overhead with the eerie calm of predators that knew the battlefield better than their prey. A British sailor wrote in his diary, "It felt as if we knew their thoughts." The U-boats struck back with all the fury they could muster, sinking 7 ships after repeated attacks. But their victories evaporated against the staggering reality of the losses. 7 U-boats sunk, several more crippled Wolfpack's scattered convoy completed its crossing, 95% of cargo delivered intact. It was the largest U-boat defeat in history until that point, a tactical and psychological catastrophe. For the Germans, the question became suffocating. How do you fight an enemy who seems to see through the dark itself? Act 4, Human Element, Voices from the Deep. A U-boat captain's despair. Captain Lieutenant Jürgen Essen wrote, "The ocean is no longer ours. The dark, once our ally, betrays us. The sky falls upon us without warning. The men grow restless. I cannot promise them anything but uncertainty." His words echoed across dozens of boats. A British escort captain's relief. Commander Peter Gretton, exhausted and hollow-eyed, scribbled, "Hope is the rarest commodity at sea. Tonight, for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe we might be turning the tide." A radio operator's memory. A U-boat survivor recalled, "We were at periscope depth. A sound, like a whisper. Then explosions. The lights died. Men screamed. Water poured through the hatches. We surfaced into fire. These fragments, fear, hope, revelation, formed the emotional fabric of May 1943. Act V, Consequences, the collapse of the U-boat arm. By the end of the 8 weeks, the results were catastrophic. 41 U-boats destroyed in May alone, over 1,500 trained submariners killed, convoy losses dropped to their lowest levels of the war, convoys crossed with near-impunity, wolfpacks disintegrated into isolated, desperate boats. In raw numbers, Germany could not replace the men or the machines. The U-boat force was being eaten alive faster than it could grow. Worse still was the psychological impact. Veteran captains returned speaking of impossible detection ranges, omnipresent aircraft, and escorts appearing out of nowhere. Younger crews hesitated to fire, to surface, to trust their instruments. A historian would later write, "The U-boat arm did not just lose its boats. It lost its confidence, its secrecy, and its myth." The strategic outcome. The Allies now understood something Germany did not. The Battle of the Atlantic was effectively won. Supply ships reached Britain in record numbers. American divisions prepared for future offensives with stockpiles of equipment. The invasion of Europe became not just possible but inevitable. Act 6, Reflection, the ocean redefined. May 1943 was not simply a bad month for the U-boats. It was the collapse of an era. It marked the moment when lone hunters gave way to coordinated naval air systems, industrial capacity crushed tactical brilliance, intelligence networks overtook intuition, radar replaced raw courage, technology, not heroism, defined survival. The U-boat aces fought with extraordinary skill, endurance, and belief. But their world shifted faster than any individual could comprehend. They were masters of a battlefield that no longer existed. This 8-week crisis reveals a hard truth about war and human nature. Even the greatest warriors cannot outfight a transformation. They cannot overcome the moment when innovation becomes destiny. And in May 1943, destiny belonged to the convoys, untouchable at last. The Atlantic in the months after May 1943 carried a different sound. Where once the ocean had echoed with the distant detonation of torpedoes and the wrenching screams of ships breaking apart, now the water felt strangely calm. Convoys moved with a confidence that bordered on ritual. Men on deck still scanned the horizon, of course, still felt the weight of danger, but the air no longer vibrated with the same primal fear that had defined the early years of the war. Something profound had shifted, not just in strategy or technology, but in the psychology of nations. The U-boat threat, once the dark specter haunting every shipping lane, had been broken. Not destroyed entirely, not yet, but broken in spirit, in effectiveness, in the ability to bend the war to its will. And as the summer of 1943 unfolded, the world was forced to confront the meaning of that transformation. The long shadow after victory. For the Allies, the triumph brought both relief and revelation. The victory over the U-boats was more than a military success. It was proof that industrial might, scientific ingenuity, and multinational coordination could overcome even the deadliest enemy. In the quiet corridors of the Admiralty, in the map rooms at Norfolk, in the intelligence huts of Bletchley Park, men and women realized they had helped turn the tide of the entire war. The convoy system, once considered a desperate necessity, had become a symbol of endurance. It proved that democracy could adapt, innovate, and protect itself even under the most suffocating pressure. And the sea lanes remained open. Cargo ships now raced across the Atlantic faster than ever, delivering the raw materials of liberation. Sherman tanks, food supplies, ammunition, spare parts, landing craft, aircraft engines, medical equipment. These shipments would form the backbone of the campaigns in Italy, in Normandy, and beyond. The defeat of the U-boats did not just save Britain. It set the stage for the defeat of Nazi Germany itself. But history is rarely so clean. Every victory carries a shadow. The cost for Germany, lessons learned in ruin. For the German Navy, the aftermath of May 1943 was a slow, painful awakening. Dönitz ordered new designs, including the advanced Type XXI, Elektroboot, hoping to reclaim dominance with technology of his own. But the submarine that might have changed the war arrived too late, starved of resources and hammered by Allied bombing. The surviving U-boat crews returned to bases that no longer felt like sanctuaries. The grand pens, built of concrete meters thick, echoed with the silence of absence. Boats that never came home, officers whose caps would never again appear in victory photos. The once proud U-boat arm shrank from elite spearhead to desperate defender. And yet, in their defeat, the U-boats revealed an enduring truth. No weapon, however feared, can survive unchanged in a world that refuses to stand still. The men who sailed beneath the waves were not defeated by cowardice or incompetence. Many were among the most skilled sailors of the war. They were defeated by a world that had shifted around them, by radar they could not detect, by code breaking they did not suspect, by aircraft that erased the concept of a safe zone, by factories whose output dwarfed anything the Reich could match. It was not the destruction of a fleet. It was the collapse of a paradigm. Irony at the end of a dark road. There is a moral irony to May 1943, one that lingers when the immediate triumph fades. 4 years, Germany believed the U-boat campaign would starve Britain into submission, isolating the island and forcing a negotiated peace. But the opposite occurred. The more desperate the submarine offensive became, the more urgently the Allies innovated, coordinated, and industrialized. In trying to suffocate their enemy, the U-boats pushed their foe into becoming stronger, smarter, and more united. And when the wolf packs reached their peak numbers in early 1943, they sowed the seeds of their own destruction. By forcing the Allies to improve escorts, deploy long-range aircraft, mass-produce radar, accelerate code breaking, and expand shipyards, Germany unintentionally created the most sophisticated maritime defense network the world had ever seen. It was a strategic reversal so profound that it redefined the meaning of naval warfare. A symbolic memory, the light over the waves. If there is one image that captures the essence of this turning point, it is the sudden bloom of a Lee light over a black ocean. A U-boat on the surface, engines rumbling, sailors scanning the horizon, when suddenly a cone of white light bursts down from above, blinding, pure, merciless. That moment encapsulated the entire transformation. The darkness that once protected the U-boats had been shattered. Their invisibility, their mythology, their advantage, it evaporated in an instant. And for the Allies, that light became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of knowledge overcoming fear, science overcoming secrecy, and civilization refusing to bow to the predators of the deep. The legacy of May 1943. In the decades that followed the war, historians, naval officers, engineers, and veterans looked back on those 8 weeks as one of the most decisive turning points in the entire conflict. The Battle of the Atlantic, once a grinding stalemate, transformed into a one-sided struggle that opened the pathway to victory on land. The lessons lived on. Technology must evolve, or perish. The Germans learned too late that their dominance depended on secrecy and surprise, both of which dissolved under Allied innovation. Coordination beats individual brilliance. The U-boat aces were extraordinary sailors, but they fought alone against a system built on teamwork. Industry is the backbone of warfare. Radar sets, escort carriers, code-breaking machines, Liberty ships. These were the unsung forces that shaped strategy. Human endurance defines the battlefield. Convoy sailors endured cold, fear, and endless hours. U-boat crews survived darkness, pressure, and constant terror. Both sides bore scars that lasted lifetimes. But perhaps the greatest legacy is this. The defeat of the U-boats proved that even in an age of mechanized war, the real battle is fought in the space between what humans believe and what they are willing to become. Closing reflection. The universal meaning. The story of May 1943 does not end with victory or defeat. It ends with understanding. It shows how quickly the world can change, and how dangerous it is to anchor oneself to past glories. It reveals that power is not static, but a living force that shifts with every innovation, every decision, every discovery. It reminds us that courage, while noble, cannot stand alone against transformation. And it teaches that even the most unstoppable force can become vulnerable if it fails to see the future pressing in around it. In the cold, gray waves of the North Atlantic, amid the wreckage of submarines and the steady passage of convoys, one truth emerged stronger than steel. No empire, no weapon, no strategy remains untouchable forever. And as long as humanity continues to push the boundaries of technology and belief, the ocean, like history itself, will remain a place where dominance is temporary, and understanding is the only lasting victory.